pragmatically, for me, speaking is the hardest part. Definitely, I constantly feel struggle. Even now, I still struggle at some point. So for certain pronunciation and linking part, especially at the beginning, when I came to the States, nobody could really understand me. It's hard for me, for people to understand me because I was using the muscle to speak Mandarin and then to speak English, and my accent was really heavy. Only people who want to understand me could understand me.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Orbital Media Podcast, where we learn about human perspective, culture, and story one interview at a time. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so in order for us to continue making content in the coming weeks and months. Now in this episode, we're going to be talking about what it's like to learn English. I'm really curious to get into the perspective of the experience of learning another language, especially one such as English, which I think for a lot of you out there might be your first language. But for many of you out there, it might not be. It probably is not if you are not in an English-speaking majority country. So I want to today talk to Zihan Zhao and her experience of what it's like learning English from a Mandarin perspective, i.e. Chinese. So Zihan, do you want to quickly tell everyone out there a little bit about yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Zihan Zhao and I came to LA about 7 years ago. So I came here with no English speaking background. I think I could read a little bit, but I don't think I was able to order food or do a lot of daily grind. But then I went to a college to learn English, and then later I went to UCLA. So now I got a master's degree. So I think for me, learning English is probably one of the most proud things that I've done so far.
Okay, nice. And so just for a very quick background, for anyone who maybe doesn't know, is there any quick rundown of Mandarin that you can give people? Like what, it's a language, but any other quick details maybe?
Yeah, I think it's based on, it's kind of based on, every character looks like a little symbol. So it's like every character really based on its meaning. So that makes things very hard. So that's why Mandarin also have different dialects. So we all speak very different dialects. Sometimes we don't even really know each other, but we understand the meaning just based on the characters.
So I guess to start at the beginning, I'm very curious to hear about your experience of learning English. Mm-hmm. What was it like learning English?
Well, first of all, from the pronunciation, I think the pronunciation is very different than Chinese, because English has a Latin or Germanic language root. So the pronunciation is super different, especially for consonants. Like in Chinese, we don't have a very crisp sound because all the consonants, it has to, come with a vowel. So it makes the language is very, staccato. But as opposed to English, it's kind of you have to flow. You have to especially for American English, I feel the consonant, I either hit it too much where I would have an extra syllable, follow it, or there's just no consonants for me. So it's hard for me to get a balance. And that's pronunciation wise, but then in terms of the grammar, it's also very difficult for us. So for me, especially at the beginning time when I came to the US, I just felt why does verb always have to change? Why do you always have to change past tense or, future tense or perfect past tense or whatever tense is? Why there are so many, why do you have to change so much? So as opposed to in Mandarin, all you gotta do is just add a timeline.
What do you mean by add a timeline?
So for example, you just use every tense. You use present tense for everything, and then you just add yesterday. So people would know that something happened yesterday. But then, yeah, I think I'm just getting too deep right now.
No. That's the thing. I'm actually curious to get into this. I mean, I'm not a linguist. But I'm very interested in how do languages function? How do they operate differently?
Yeah, I'm not linguistic either, but I do think I'm very interested in that as well, because I think that definitely tells a lot about people's lifestyle. and like the culture, the history that formed this language into this way. So, and but then I do think English is very accurate. It's very specific. So when I got used to, like speaking English, I feel like, so I don't have to ask people, did did this activity happen yesterday? So because it's already in the language, so you wouldn't, have this type of question.
Yeah. What I've heard is from other people who have learned English that English it's a very precise language, especially in terms of time. When things are happening in the past or present or future, there's a lot of ways to describe exactly the way in which a thing is happening in English. If it's continuously happening, or if it might happen in the future, it did happen, or it was happening. There are a lot of different verbs, which makes it challenging, but also very precise.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would you say, I guess there are obviously very difficult things about English, and coming from a Mandarin background with a completely different writing system, what would you feel was the hardest aspect? I mean, there are maybe multiple hard aspects of learning English.
The hardest aspect learning, for example, I feel, because I just mentioned consonants, right? Consonants is definitely something hard for me, and vowels. The vowels are also very different, because I feel like I think the tricky thing is like sometimes when you hear it, especially I came to States as an adult, or like my brain already lost the ability to learn languages as a kid. So for me, I have to like listen really carefully about the vowels, because some vowels can be, similar to Mandarin, but after a period of time that I study it, I found it's actually really, really different. So, for example, like the dim sound, like O.
Oh.
But in Mandarin, we have something really similar, but it's actually very different, which is O.
Okay.
Do you find this? Yeah. But then in English, in American English, you have to, it's like O.
Yeah.
As opposed to O.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, when I just say go, it's same. Like it sounds very similar, but it's actually no, there's like something different. Yeah.
And then what about something that you think is, I guess, it's hard to say something you find easier about English the more you've learned it, but is there anything about the language that you find objectively maybe easier than
English?
Mandarin?
Well, typing.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, when you want to chat people, when you want to typing, well, then, it just feels like a lot more easier, because English is just like letters, but in Chinese you have the different system. You have to type it and then you select which one you should use. So that's like very. Oh yeah, the other like hard part that I forgot to mention is preposition.
Okay.
Prepositions. Sometimes I got like, even many years after living in the States, I still got confused about when should I use in and when should I use at or on, it's kind of confusing for me.
It's sometimes even confusing with some cases of English if you get like a really obscure verb or some kind of very specific case. Even sometimes English speakers aren't sure if it's like, do we use on or do we use in?
So like the phrase on the team or in the team.
Right, yes. Right.
Yeah, sometimes they can be like really specific in different phrase. Yeah, so that's kind of like, but I think all the languages have certain rules that you can't really explain. You just have to like memorize it.
And actually about that memorizing, so from an English perspective, I always think of with Mandarin, the very difficult things are not the alphabet, but the character system, the logography, it's a logographic system, so logography. And then the tones, like the sound of the language. It's like, because it's a tonal language.
Yeah.
Which is, for people who don't know, right, a tonal language is where you can say the same word, but if you say it in a different tone, it means a totally different word.
Yeah.
Versus English is like not a tonal language, so if you say hello and hello 2 different ways, it still means hello.
Yeah.
And so from an English perspective, that's a very difficult thing for me to kind of grasp and understand.
Yeah. In terms of that, I also want to, just have some perspectives about, like the tone. Because I feel like in Chinese, the tones are very specific.
Well, for people who maybe don't know, do you want to do a quick intro on what the tones are?
So Chinese has 4 tones, like a flat tone, which is ah, and the second tone sounds like a question, it's like ah, and then there's also a third tone, it's kind of like a twist, so it'll be ah, and then the fourth tone, which sounds like a confirmation, that sounds like how you say yes, which is ah. So like these 4 tones are, like it's easy to talk about, but when you just, in terms of like communication, it could be really confusing. It takes like a long time for English speakers to, learn that and how to use that. It's very confusing.
Yeah. I mean, I've certainly not learned Mandarin. I dabbled with it for, probably a few hours total in my life. And like, I found the third one versus the second one to be very confusing, especially.
It is very confusing.
1 and 4, I kind of got that. But, between 2 and 3, I always got really confused about.
It is really confusing because the third tone, it constantly changes. Sometimes it could change. Depends on which character, the other character. So it kind of varies sometimes. That's why it's kind of confusing.
Yeah. And then what about the writing system? So basically how it works, for.
Yeah, it's just based on its meaning. So for example, like let's talk about the door. Like the character for door, it actually looks like a door. And some other characters like a mountain, like how it's written, it actually just looks like a mountain.
But in terms of I'm curious, like when you learn writing Mandarin, kind of how it works, do you just have to kind of memorize every single character and how it looks? Or sort of like with English, are there certain like patterns that come up again and again? And once you learn some of these patterns, it helps you know how to write things out?
Yeah, totally. People call us like radicals. Okay. So basically, a lot of characters, especially for some like complex characters, they have different radicals. But you can repeatedly see different same radicals over and over again in different characters. So for example, let's just talk about different 2 characters. Let's talk about like the sun and the moon, right? Like the sun, when you see the sun, is how it's written, and then moon, that's how it's written. But then if you like connect them together, this character it means light.
Okay.
So it's actually pretty. But then later, if you see like sun with different character, that also indicate that something happened in the day.
Okay.
Yeah, it happens. It either happens in the day or like with some light.
Okay. And I mean, so it's a similar idea to English, and I'm sure a lot of other languages.
Yeah.
I mean, did you find with English, once you could kind of also pick up on some of the patterns, that helped in some way, or was it a lot less obvious because of the way English works, where you don't see images of something, but it's more...
I feel like this is interesting. Honestly, I feel like English is totally opposite for me.
Okay.
I mean, like, I can only speak for me.
Yeah,
I feel like English is more for the sound. It's more it's more like of a sound language. For example, like, let's say, I don't want to say like really the word that we discovered, but like let's say something
now
like.
I'm curious what that word is.
I'll tell you later.
Okay. Is it a 4-letter word?
It's not a good word, so I don't want to talk about it.
Well,
we'll talk about it later. But
okay.
then this is like something just pop out in my mind. Let's talk about throat. Throat. Like when you say throat, you have to. I just feel like, for me, like you have to. There's something in your throat.
Throat.
Yeah, there's like it's at the back. It just feels like your throat had to like open a little bit. So that's like something that I found like very interesting, because you actually have to do a movement like at like the deep like throat part.
Yeah. Well, also with a lot of the patterns, though, I think about so Greek and Latin especially influence English a lot in terms of, generally when you're learning English growing up as your first language, the sense is that certain endings or certain beginning sections of words give you a clue as to maybe what that word might mean.
Yeah.
And I don't know if, but again, it's a sound based and spelling.
Yeah.
It's not like a character kind of in the same way.
Yeah.
I don't know if you came across any of those, or there are only two that I can think of that were pre-prepared, which is the letters EX. Which is sort of going to be, it's going to be outside or not within.
Exactly.
So like, or it'll be very, like extreme or extraordinary, but you can also have like exoskeleton.
Yeah.
Or exclude.
Yeah.
And so it'll be something that's either very intense or outside or like away.
That makes sense. And the other thing, you just reminded me like a previous.
Yeah, exactly,
and
right.
And in other words, like
previous, prehistoric, right?
Yeah.
Predecessor,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which are going to be all before,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Early or before. Yeah, and there are other things too, like government type will end in archy or crassy, which is from Greek. So.
Oh yeah, like at the end.
At the end,
that's
something
totally...
like a monarchy or a democracy, and that means like it's a type of government of how you run somewhere.
And Tion.
Yeah.
Like something like that.
Shun
or Zhen.
Yeah, exactly. So did you find that became sort of helpful for you, or sort of not?
Yeah,
not
definitely. So especially when I started learning English, sometimes I have to I got confused about if this word is a adjective or it's a noun or it's a verb, because it all comes from the same verb, but then it has different modification. So definitely convert, and there's a word conversion.
Yeah.
Right. So that really helps me understand how. So even though I don't know what it means, but I know that that's a noun, or like if it's a verb.
In terms of like the process that you went through learning English, I'm kind of curious to hear about that. Like, what was the experience like, and like what did you kind of do to learn a language as an adult?
So when I was in China, so we all like study English at school. But then, I just felt like when we studied English, it was more like for the test. I know how to read, and I have like a basic grammar knowledge about English, but it's really basic. And later so when I came to the States, I literally, I suddenly realized, like I was put in an environment that I couldn't understand anything. Or like I think I could understand something really like basic, like how are you, like something. But then the thing is like, I also put in an environment. I feel like everybody just speaks so fast. I just felt like I needed a subtitle. Yeah, because I feel like I definitely have like a basic vocabulary and grammar in my head, but I just can't decipher what people are saying. But I think it's definitely took me a few months to get a like basic understanding, so I was able to order food, and a lot of like things that happened is more like a culturally, like literally I went to restaurants, I went to Chipotle, but I don't know what to order. Like the only thing that I know is a burrito. Like because it's burritos, it's like only one word. There's like if they ask me like, do you need to add any like extra, I wouldn't be able to answer it. Yeah. And then so I decided, I feel like definitely I have to go to school. That's where I can really put myself in a, especially I feel like in LA when I just came here, because LA is so diverse, it's so multicultural. And I was living in my uncle's house where there's a lot of Chinese people. So technically I feel like I could have just like speaking Chinese just around the area. So I would, but then later I just felt I have to learn English. So I went to a school. I went to a community college where I can really learn English, really put myself in an English environment. That was really helpful.
What was that like, learning in a community college as an adult?
Yeah. So I went to this ESL classes where there's a lot of foreign students. So I was one of them. That was pretty cool. So, we studied like a grammar, like from really simple, really basic, and we did a lot of like tests, like writing, and then also, I went to writing center. It was pretty cool because they offering, free tutoring. So I was able to, learn how to write an English essay I just feel like English essay is also, it's very structured. There's like a certain structure that you have to follow. But once you follow the structure, you can get really good grades. So I think that's like really helpful. And I also learned a lot of like how to write in phrases and how to structurize the entire essay to make it like a really flow. That's really helpful for me to, like later I did my TOEFL test. That's how I got into UCLA. You have to do the TOEFL test, and I tried 4 times because I wanted to get like 100 score.
A score of 100, yeah.
Yeah. So when you go to UCLA, you don't have to take ESL classes anymore.
Right.
So my goal is get to 100, but the highest score I got is 98. So I always feel like, oh my God, I could have just get the 2 more points. I get 2 more points, so I don't have to do ESL anymore. But I just couldn't. I tried 4 times, but I couldn't. And aside from that, I also took a lot of like acting classes. So that's really kind of gave me that's kind of like gave me a path since I came to LA, because I wasn't like one of those students who were really good at math or like English. I was like 0, but math I was kind of like 0 as well.
You were like -0.
Yeah. So literally I feel like, what can I do in LA? And then so luckily I went to this acting classes because the initial reason was just learn English, because I feel like that's actually, because in the ESL classes you do writing and reading, you do a lot of basic stuff, but then I don't think I was able to, I don't think I was getting a lot of like, conversational practices until I went to acting classes where you have to interact with people, where you have to, like put yourself on stage and just talk about yourself, talk about your experience. That was scary, to be honest, for a person who doesn't speak English and you have to do it on stage.
Well, how did you get over that? I mean, I've never done any sort of performance in another language where you have to A, think about speaking the language correctly, but then B, you have to perform and actually also emote in a way that is, entertaining or engaging to an audience.
Yeah. So basically, this is what I don't have a simple answer, but basically this is something that I try to convince myself every time before I perform. When I didn't speak English, I just literally tell myself, hey, nobody knows you here. Like whatever you do, whatever you say, even though it's embarrassing, when you walk out of the door, nobody will remember. Just like be yourself and then just like do whatever you want to do, and then just forget about the embarrassing part. So, but it took time. Like at the beginning, it was really scary, especially in acting class. But I think there's something that you can find clues in acting classes where it's not just talking, because there's also other activities, right? So I just follow other people. You just watch, you just do whatever other people are doing, so you kind of figure out what you can do. And also I think it's very good for learning English is that sometimes I don't really know what they're saying, but then there's certain exercises or activities that acting teacher will let you do in a class. They repeatedly happen. So later you'll understand, oh, this is what they're talking about. So they actually, you learn things in a very, very active way. So I think it's actually pretty good to learn English.
And that's sort of that's after you have enough of a base of knowledge of English through taking classroom instruction that you can then, you're not having to sort of, well, I mean, you're still learning the language and figuring it out while you're acting, but it's not like I don't speak English at all and I have to just figure it out through performance.
Yeah. I think it's like half and half. For sometimes I do understand the instruction, but I feel like seriously, I could put it in this way. Because at the beginning, when I came to the States, when I was in the acting class, I was able to understand like 20%. But then later, after a year, maybe I felt like, I could understand 30%. And then later, you just get better and better. And definitely it's like half and half. Sometimes I understand what you guys are doing. Sometimes I literally just have no idea what they're doing. But then definitely, like learning the stuff from the script is really helpful. That's like initially I just think, okay, if I can memorize everything on the script, so those scripts, like the dialogue that's on the script in the play, will become my language. Yeah, so because I feel like that's a great way to actually learn how to converse in English. Does that make sense?
The sense of reading dialogue on a page and then performing it?
Yes, because
Okay.
at the beginning when you didn't have a lot of grammar, didn't have a good grammar grasp, or like you don't have like a big vocabulary, right? So you learn the script in the play, and then you learn how they communicate and how what type of vocabulary that they're using, the character using, and the grammar. So that's a great way for me to learn English, because that's actually, because it's different than the textbook. Because the textbook could be a little bit too, like technical and not really conversational. But in the script, it's all conversation. Yeah. So it's perfect for me to learn English.
Well, yeah, that idea about there's sort of the spoken version of a language and then there's the technical written version of a language. They're not the same thing. People don't speak like textbooks are written.
Exactly.
Did you find that challenging in that there were sort of, I don't want to call it two versions of English, but the way that you would write and the way that you would speak would not be the same thing?
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, definitely agree with you, especially in terms of like the conversational type. Yes, definitely. And sometimes even in textbook, especially I feel like in the ESL textbook, it's more for instructions about grammar and like some basic vocabulary. Yeah, but then like in a actual play or like a screenplay, that's just actually how people will talk.
Yeah. Did you find one easier than the other? Because there are the four things, right? There's speaking, listening, writing, and reading a language.
Well, definitely, like in the script, if just like do a conversational English, it's much easier than an essay.
Than an essay, okay.
Yeah, I remember like the essays. Like the reading part in TOEFL test, it was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And it was like so.
Interesting. So between the four, you found, between speaking, listening, writing, and reading, you found speaking actually to be would you say, the easiest?
Pragmatically, for me, speaking is the hardest part. Definitely, I constantly feel struggle. Even now, I still struggle at some point. So for certain pronunciation and linking part, and also, speaking also requires you have a really good grammar and listening. Because like when it's on the page, it's actually not that difficult. Especially, we learn English when we're in China, because I already know how to read. Yeah. So, but then after coming here, I just feel like speaking is really difficult for me. As in the pronunciation, like I just told you, it's really hard for me. And sometimes, especially at the beginning when I came to the States, nobody could really understand me. It's hard for me, for people to understand me, because I was using the muscle to speak Mandarin and then to speak English, and my accent was really heavy. So nobody, only people who want to understand me could understand me.
Do you find that, I'm curious, the instruction in English when you were in China, sort of how well or not well you felt that prepared you?
I think definitely I've learned a lot of like a vocabulary. I have when I came here, I had a like certain vocabulary that I can understand, and I know how to read. So I don't think that was like that big of an issue. The thing is it's just like my brain couldn't really process in like when people speaking fast. So it took me a long time to really, even sometimes I feel like I remember even when I was in grad school, in a like a directing class or like acting classes is better, but in a directing class when people talk so fast, I'm the only like a foreign student in my class. But then when they talked about their like what they had in like the things that happened in their childhood and culturally, I just couldn't follow.
What about people whose first language was not English, but they were speaking not from Mandarin? So let's say Spanish speakers.
Oh, that's a very good question. This is literally something that I have so, because as a ESL, like we talk about that a lot, especially for bilingual people. So for example, I had this conversation with my friend who's Taiwanese American, and then his first language is English, but then he grew up in Taiwan until he became a young teenager, and then he came back to the States. He doesn't have any accent. So we talked about this, but then he told me some like sensation. He said, when you speak Mandarin, so your tongue is kind of like, can I say like more twisted? But then when you speak English, your tongue is always fixed. Yeah, so the way that he describes really speaks for me as well, because that's where I struggle the most. Like when I speak English, I think most of my accents is just sometimes my tongue just can't get flat. Like my tongue is always kind of tensed.
I'm curious, aside from Mandarin, people who are speaking English from other backgrounds, like again, Spanish maybe, or Korean, or like a language, like Hindi or something, a language from India. Did you find, were there any people that you ever compared notes with on like, oh, you're struggling as well? How are you finding things?
Yeah, definitely. Like I know like in Japanese, people don't say R. Yeah, so that's something that they struggle with. And what is so interesting, it's even more interesting because I have a friend who also speaks Swedish and English. And I was like, for me, I always think that Swedish is very similar to English. It's not very similar, but it's not that far. But he described something that was very interesting. He said, when he speaks English, he always feel like his throat is like, it's almost like he's almost like using his throat to speak English. And he feels like, when he describes it, like he always feel like you have to stick your tongue out. But I felt it's very interesting because in terms of my experience, when I speak Mandarin, I never felt like I have to stick my tongue out. But literally, I feel like that really kind of like when I speak English, I do feel like if I stick my tongue out, like it get easier. When I try to like using my throat to speak English, it does become easier for me.
I don't think about that with a native language, and it's very interesting to hear. So you talk about the tongue being very flat, almost needing to stick your tongue out to speak the language, using your throat more.
Yeah.
Anything else like that feels, I guess, strange to you?
English?
Yeah.
Definitely. Like what let's say, this is a hard question because I feel like everything was strange for me when I didn't speak English. When I was learning English, everything was, especially for TH sound, it's still I still struggle because sometimes I either have it or sometimes I don't have it. Sometimes you hit too strong or it's still very and L. L is something. Yeah, L is something because in Chinese there's no O sound. It's the L. People say L, but people don't. What they're like nobody would say O.
Right. There's no double. Yeah, I mean, well, that's interesting because I always think like Chinese. There's definitely an L sound, but it's like is it a short L? It's not a.
It's L.
Okay. The TH. I think I've heard that's very common because there are very few languages in the world that have a TH in them. And certainly, you've got like the TH in Greek, and you have it in the spelling of some other European languages, but even like in German, you don't really pronounce, like they'll spell TH, but you don't really pronounce a TH in German. It's more of just like a ta sort of sound. But like English, it's very strong as well. So that's not surprising. I've also heard the R sound. This is again other not necessarily Mandarin, but other languages that the American hard R. People sometimes struggle with that as well. It's just a video. There's one video I watched about that.
I feel like what is so interesting. I heard people say like Spanish speaker. They said Japanese is easier for them. As in the pronunciation is very similar because they don't have R either, right?
Yeah. Well, no, there are plenty of R's, but there's the way people describe American English is the R's are very hard, like this.
Yeah.
You don't have that same heavy consonant sound with Japanese and Spanish. You definitely have R's in them. I mean, Japanese, there are plenty of R's in Japanese.
That's actually a very good discovery because I feel like in all the other languages don't really have like hard R. Yeah, yes. American English are very hard R.
Interesting. I don't know. I mean, do you have, not to flip it around, but like, do you have any questions for me about English? Like, why is this thing the way it is? Or like, I never understood X. And it just made no sense or anything like that?
I've always been interested in like English as a language, like how it become, because I feel like literally, compared to a lot of like European languages, English is actually pretty easy for a lot of it. Yeah. And how it became modern English and how like grammatically and vocabulary-wise.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so again, with the statement, of course, to begin with, that I'm not a linguistic historian. I'm going off of what I know here, which is more than nothing, but we'll do the best that we can. So originally, right, so English starts as something called Old English, which if you listen to the sound of it, and there are recordings on YouTube and whatnot we can hear, it sounds very Germanic. It sounds very much like something that, a German person would be speaking. Then you've got, and this gets into, English history basically, you've got Old English comes in with Germanic invaders who kind of invade the island and kind of conquer what becomes England later on. Then you have an invasion by people called the Normans, they're French speakers basically. This is a sort of the Middle Ages. They kind of invade England, William the Conqueror and the Norman Knights, for sort of British history aficionados out there. And so for a couple hundred years, French is actually the language that educated upper class people speak in England. English it's like a peasant's language. It's spoken by common people, lower class people, and this is where I'm sort of a little hazy on things. So I think a historical linguist would probably have a better sense of this than me. But what I understand is, because you had a language that the upper class was not speaking, so the upper class is speaking French, lower class is speaking English, over the course of a couple hundred years, aspects of the language became slightly more simplified because people were learning it. The people who were saying, all right, we're going to, slowly merge into becoming English speakers, they simplified things along the way because they were not approaching English as their native language. They were approaching it as French French-speaking upper-class people, and so certain things became a little easier. And whenever things are set in the Middle Ages, right, in like a movie or a TV show or whatever, you'll often hear these terms like thee or thou when people are, or like thine,
like
thine.
in Shakespeare.
Like in Shakespeare, right? They'll have these extra words, and it always sounds very old-timey when you have versions of like thee and thine and thou. And those were older versions of ways of saying like you. But over time, those fell out of use, and eventually you were just left with you. So in other languages, and you have this a little bit in Spanish actually too, where there's a form of English called, there's a form of Spanish called vosotros, which is like you plural, and it's technically it's like an informal form of you all, but it stopped getting used in the Americas when people were speaking Spanish in the Americas. They still use it in Spain, but not in the Americas. And so in the Americas, they just use something called ustedes, which is like you all, but it's a single form of it. And so in that way, it's an example of there's a Spanish being technically slightly simpler in grammar in the Americas versus in Spain. But the same thing, even within England, happened with English, where there were more, we would think of complicated versions of the way the language worked that became more simplified over time. And so that's how you only got things like you, and you only got things like the, where there's no other form of the, it's just the. And you compare that to other certain European languages. Again, I can't speak to I can't speak to Russian, but I know for sure with German and French and Italian and Spanish and Portuguese, you have at the minimum 2, in some cases 3 versions of the.
Yeah, well, I've heard of it. It's even more confusing.
Yeah, that is, and again, I don't speak German fluently or anything. I've dabbled in a little bit, and one of the things I find is so confusing is these multiple versions of the that they have. With Spanish, you can kind of like, you've got el and la, and you can line that up pretty well with the sound of the word. But with German, it's like, I can't understand it at all. I don't know there's no logic to it. But English, basically, it became a slightly more simplified version of the language as time went on, versus some other languages. And it's not obvious that happened after the language became much more global and this sort of imperial language. It seems that it happened when it was still existing in England itself, but because of the way that you had, again, these French-speaking Norman nobles over time sort of simplifying the language to make it perhaps easier for themselves to speak it.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
You know?
But then why did they want to speak English?
Well, because over time they were still just, and again, I'll put a qualifier here. Again, if anyone wants to check me on this, please let me know in the comments. But my understanding was because they weren't a huge portion of the population. They were only a couple percent of the population. They were a ruling minority population. Oh. So over time, and also, over a few generations, right? If you're only a couple percent of the population and everyone else in the environment speaks a different language to you, the longer you live on that piece of land, the more, just for ease of communication, you're going to have to learn the language that the overwhelming majority of the population speaks. And you could even imagine, right, over time, someone who their kids, the parents speak French and they only speak French and they're like, we don't speak English, that's what peasants speak. But over time, a few generations, right, the kids start to pick up more English as time goes on, just from them living in a world where over time, English becomes a language that they will speak more and more. And eventually, they might learn French because they have to, because it's like, that's what you do. And they might be bilingual, but then another 100 years go by and even fewer and fewer people become bilingual. And eventually it gets to the point where, and this was, my understanding of English for a while, up until not even that long ago, the mid 20th century, everyone is a native English speaker, but if you're upper class, if you're well-to-do, and if you're a cultured and educated person, of course you will learn French, and you just will learn that language, that will be the second language that you learn. And that cultural holdover continued for hundreds of years. Within British society, less so in American society, but you even had a little bit of that in American society where, I mean, really up until I would say even World War II, if you were upper class and if you were well-to-do, you'd learn French. That was French and Latin would be the two languages that you would learn. But English is also kind of interesting because it's a Germanic language, so structurally it is related to German, but the majority of the words that we use in English, the majority of the words that exist in English derive from French and Latin and Greek.
That's very interesting.
But the number of words that you use on a regular basis, the common words that you use, most of those are still also Germanic.
Wow.
In their
so
structure.
Interesting.
So it's...
what about grammar?
Grammar is mostly, I was gonna say it's mostly German, but grammar is also a little weird with English because it's not the same as German, but it's also not quite exactly the same as Spanish or French, but it's more similar, I'd say, to French and Spanish. The thing, again, that's strange about the language is it's not so much that modern English and modern German are very similar, it's more that modern English and modern German evolved from a common ancestor and they evolved in separate different directions. So if you went back 1,000 years, you would have seen more similarities between English and German, but now there aren't as many because they've evolved in these different directions. It's like Dutch as well. Dutch evolved sort of in a different direction. There's a language called Frisian, which is spoken in parts of northern Netherlands and a coastal part of Germany. It's not a big language, it's kind of dying out, but it's, by some people's claims, it's the most similar language to English that still exists.
What is it called?
It's called Frisian or Frisian.
Frisian?
And it's a very small language. It's not a lot of people speak it anymore, but it's in parts of the Netherlands and Germany. But that's sort of a thing that went on. The other thing I'm curious about, and I can talk about spelling in a second versus pronunciation, is another common issue with English that I hear, not as bad as French, but a common issue I heard with English is the spelling of English versus the pronunciation of English, and it being often very confusing for people with a lot of these strange rules. And so in terms of spelling, the whole aspect of putting an E at the end of a word or not, and how that will change the sound of it, right?
Yeah, that's a good point about the E at the end.
So
because sometimes there's a sound.
Yes, so
sometimes there's
fin, so F-I-N, the fin on a fish, right? F-I-N-E, fine.
Yeah.
Right, it's not finny, it's fine.
Yeah.
Right, but why would it be that? Shouldn't it be finny because it's F-I-N-E? But we say fine. So it because you've got the Z, it changes the first part. Some people said that they find that kind of strange, and
I never found it any. I feel like I definitely agree with you, but for me it's because I feel like anything in English was strange for me. So I never even doubted, this is what I learned, I'm just gonna learn this way. So I never even have a lot of question about why is this way, because I'm from a really different background, so it's I'll just take it. It's strange, I'll just do it.
Okay, because it was, I suppose that makes sense, because it is the first language you've learned that is a sort of European
I only speak
language.
I only speak English and Chinese, and they're super different. So I can't really compare those because it's it's just totally opposite.
Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's a comment that I get a lot more, or that I hear more from people where they're native, Spanish speakers or Italian speakers or French speakers or German speakers, where there's those languages compared to English. The way that they're spelled, they're pronounced basically the way. Well, French is, let's not count. French is a bit strange, but Spanish and Italian and German, and if it's written a certain way, pretty much exactly how it's pronounced.
Yeah, because they share the same root. They have the similar alphabet. And then they can compare it to something as opposed to Chinese doesn't even have an alphabet.
Right, that makes sense. So you're just learning every rule is a foreign thing for you.
Yeah, because for me, I was like, I had nothing to compare as everything was so new to me. So I never had any too much like doubt or like I just didn't have anything to compare it to.
Interesting. And I mean, this is maybe a now switching it away from English for a second. Do you have any thoughts as a Mandarin speaker about like Korean and Japanese as languages?
Oh yeah, definitely. I feel like definitely, it's easier for me to learn Korean or Japanese.
Sure.
So for example, I've never taken any Japanese classes, but then I read manga and I watch anime. So I feel like when you're reading Japanese, because they use a lot of Chinese characters, even the pronunciation is already different, but then you're still able to understand it if that like written on like majority with Chinese characters.
Okay.
Yeah, and the pronunciation, because this is very interesting as well, because I know a person he grew up speaking Hokkien, which is also it's like a Chinese dialect. That's what he described to me. He said like, I feel like Japanese sounds more like Hokkien. And I was like, oh, yeah, and then I found this very interesting too, because when I speak Mandarin, I do find some resemblance with the Japanese pronunciation in certain words.
Okay, sure.
Like for example, if they say cheers, it's like kanbei.
Yeah.
And in Mandarin it's ganbei, but maybe in Hokkien it's even more similar. And in Korean they also like sound similar.
Yeah.
So it's all cheers. It all means cheers.
Yeah, no, that word's about the same in the three places. Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's very interesting. And then Korean is also very interesting as well, because when you count, it's literally just like a Mandarin with a dialect. Like it just sounds like so similar to a Chinese dialect. So, and also we share a lot of like vocabularies, because what I heard is Korean and the Chinese dialect Manchu, like which is like the Qing dynasty when they speak Manchu, it's actually they share the same root. Yeah, they share the same root, and it sounds very similar.
Yeah, there's some sort of debate on that. The whole, because Japanese and Korean they're counted as like language isolates, where they're not related to any other language that exists on the world or in the world. And whereas like Chinese is related to like Thai, for example, and it's related
I didn't even know Chinese is related to Thai.
Yeah, and like I think Burmese, like there are a couple languages, and like Vietnamese, I think as well too. Like those are related languages.
I do feel like Vietnamese could be related to Chinese. Like it sounds so similar to Cantonese.
I was gonna say that when as a person, when I listen to the sound of like Mandarin versus Cantonese versus Vietnamese, I always think Cantonese sort of sounds like if you took Mandarin and Vietnamese and you kind of like mixed them up a little bit. That's sort of what Cantonese sounds like.
Literally, sometimes I can't really distinguish like if it's like a Vietnamese or Cantonese, because I don't understand neither of them. So it just sounds very similar to me.
Yeah. Which I mean suggested that they're related languages. But yeah, Korean and Japanese are the ones where there's
not really
like there's really tenuous theories about stuff, but there's nothing really that's been proven, and so they're very intriguing in that way, because it's not like, in the case of what are called the Sinitic languages, so like Chinese and Vietnamese and I'm going to say Cantonese, like it's not mutually intelligible, and Thai and like Burmese. I know there are multiple languages in Burma, like those are related to each other, but Korean and Japanese are like they're kind of their own thing, and but there's a lot of vocabulary that have made their way in from China.
We shared very similar, so I find it's like easier for me to learn. So I always can find some like relations. It's easier for me to memorize.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit of like, this is a weird analogy, but like Chinese to Japanese, Korean is like Latin to like English or something, where it's the languages are very separate, but because you have a lot of vocabulary
kind of share
that are shared, you'll see certain words and you're like, I recognize that, and that means this thing because it comes from this other this other place.
I could say that.
Yeah. But I mean, because that's certainly the case. Yeah, for certain European languages are, as for English speakers, are easier to learn than others. You know, and the big ones are like Spanish is pretty relatively speaking, it's not as hard, and but actually things like almost nobody ever does it, but supposedly languages like Swedish and Dutch are apparently also very easy for an English speaker if you wanted to learn it. But something like Russian would be extraordinarily difficult.
Right.
Or Mandarin would be another one. Would be extraordinarily difficult. Yeah. Though I will say again, from the tiny little bit that I've done with Mandarin, I will say certain aspects of it did seem simpler compared to English when it comes to things like a verb and the way you place ideas next to each other.
Like the grammar, Chinese has
some
of that
seemed very simple and very like, okay, that's very straightforward. You don't need to be like changing things up a lot.
Yeah, because the grammatically, I think it's actually very similar to English present tense.
Yeah, and that was a strange thing, again, I noticed, where it was shocking me how similar it actually seemed in the order that you placed ideas. And tell me if I'm wrong, but what's called like the subject, when you have like the subject, verb, object, or certain languages are like subject, object, verb, or something, right? Which is...
Yeah, it's definitely, for example, I feel like, because I took Korean when I was in UCLA for 3 quarters, I'm not like fluent word, but I just feel like that was a great introduction for me to learn a third language. For example, I feel like in Korean, because a lot of they put the object at the beginning of or they put location at the beginning of the sentence. Like that's a topic. That's kind of like they need a topic first, and then they kind of describe what it was. That's just what I remembered, but I think it's definitely very interesting. It takes a little bit of time to get used to it. As opposed to in Mandarin and English, the grammatically, it sounds like it's not very different. Yeah. But it is like Chinese even have a simpler grammar than English because everything just stays the same, even though regardless you are asking a question or you are answering the question, the word sequence doesn't really change. But you just gotta figure out the timeline, and then you have to add something at the end of the sentence to make it a question.
Which is interesting that you have 2 languages that evolve in totally 100% separate environments, but they just have the same certain similar ways that people end up speaking, which is just an interesting coincidence.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
But no, I did find that it was subject, verb, object, right? So the woman walked down the street.
Yeah.
In English would be the same order of those things in Chinese.
Yeah, but then in Korean, it's kind of you put the object at the beginning.
Curious to actually go back a little bit to the writing of Mandarin, because I know couple hours maybe I've logged in terms of how you write it, but I know very little about that. Like the mechanisms of how you, when you're typing, for example, how does that work? I know you mentioned it very briefly at the beginning, where it's like you select different forms, what's the actual mechanism of if you're typing?
So, for example, each characters, because it's tonal language, right? You can easily find, a word with the same pronunciation but written in different ways, written in different characters, but they sound exactly the same. That's why when you type in, you have to select the ones that you need, because each characters there, the meaning is based on how it's written as opposed to the sound. Right. So that makes things hard for English speakers for you to learn. Yeah, so you have to have another process. You need to select. But then if you use a different typing system, which my mom, they don't like typing. Then they just write things on your phone. So that how it they can literally read it But then it's kind of just a little slower.
That's actually the idea of context, which is another thing. Again, many non-English speakers who learn English talk about another difficulty of English is the context of words and the fact that certain words can have multiple definitions. that being a very difficult, or sort of the spelling is so similar, but the words, you know, they might sound the same, like through and through.
Yeah.
Like I threw the ball and I traveled
that's
through
something
the tunnel.
That's literally that's like my like difficulty that I've been constantly encountering. For the first, you know, a few years when I was in the US, it was just so hard to actually like public speaking.
Yeah.
I always feel like so hard for me, even though I was at an acting program, but it's still hard for me to just like, you know, speaking in front of a lot of people. Definitely that's something, you know, it was very challenging for me. Even when I was in grad school, I just feel like it was very interesting because, you know, even when I was already in grad school, sometimes I just feel when I was in the class, like my soul is probably somewhere else because when the things that they talk about was really fast, I just couldn't follow. So, but then what was very interesting is just after time period, after, you know, like a few months or like a year, maybe after a year in grad school, I suddenly just feel like I could understand everything.
Interesting.
Yeah, I just feel like if I have any advice for people who are learning English, I just felt like the advice is just keep going.
Yeah.
Just, I know it's hard, it's very difficult to understand, but you just gotta keep yourself in the environment, and then suddenly you would feel like, oh my God, I suddenly just learn everything.
Yeah, it's the idea of language immersion, right? But extended language immersion, where you have to be in an environment where everyone is speaking that language for an extended period of time to slowly start to get used to how it sounds and all of that.
Yeah, and it's just happened really interesting. I don't know how our brain works at that point, but it's just suddenly. I've also heard of like a lot of people who have like ability to learn many languages.
For most people, it's in your early years, up until kind of your mid-teens. That's sort of the key period where it's much easier for you to retain memory of things. And if you learn something as an adult, it's even in your like early mid-20s, it's much harder.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for coming on and chatting about language. I always find it very fascinating. It's a topic I'm not an expert on, but I love hearing different perspectives on it, and, you know, sharing a little bit of what I know about the English language. Thanks everyone for watching. If you made it this far, please don't hesitate to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and we'll see you next time.